So this is me, or my company. There's about half a dozen of us. I rejoice in the title of Chief Narrative Officer because the bad thing about being a startup is that you have no money. The good thing is you get to make up your own job titles. We do one quite specific kind of thing. All our games are built on the Story Nexus platform, so they're all browser-based, choice-driven stories with gamey elements. The thing we're best known for is a game called FallenLondon.com. Hands up if you know that London was stolen by bats in 1861. Okay. Much neglected period of our nation's capital's history. The other nation's capital's history, I do apologise. So we thought we'd make a game about that. It's about 3 years old and it keeps on growing. We're like a kind of gang of crazed aunts in an attic somewhere knitting. It's running at 850,000 words of story at the moment, and we're still adding more. I added some more last night at about 11:30. So, FallenLondon.com used to be called Echo Bazaar, but we renamed it because people know what Fallen London means, and nobody knows what Echo Bazaar means. Tonight, this is a Forster quote that you guys may have come across. The king died and then the queen died as a story. The king died and then the queen died of grief as a plot. The king died and the queen died is what, of grief is why, and why we should care about it. And I want to talk about us trying to figure out what it is that we actually do. And I don't mean that in a philosophical or a numinous sense. I mean that we started out with a product that I was creatively excited about building, and then had a vague idea how to make money out of it, and have been spending the last 3 years trying to break into a mass audience, which any MBAs in the audience right now are face palming. Because obviously starting with a product and then trying to work out how to make money out of it rather than starting with the market and then trying to work out what to do with it is the worst possible way to go into business. But we are, against all the odds, still here 3 years later, trying to get less painfully shit at marketing. And one of the ways in which we're trying to get less painfully shit at marketing is work out what our audience actually is and how to describe what we do in less than about 5 sentences. Because 5 sentences a great elevator pitch does not make. This is one of our games. They all look fairly similar. I liked the art in this one slightly more than some of the others, which is why I used this as an example. Cabernet Noir, it's kind of a Musketeers Noir game if you're actually working for Richelieu rather than the king. And the gameplay cycle, and you can only barely call it gameplay, is a variety of cards are available to you. If you click on a card, you get a situation and a bunch of choices. The choices that are available to you depend on qualities, state about your character. There's some qualities on the left-hand side there. Qualities can be statistics, they can be statements about where you are in the story, statements about things in the world, about your relationships with other people, items, anything that could conceivably unlock a story. And if you make a choice, then you get a result, which can be randomized, and you get some quality effects. And that's the core loop, which you do again and again. You're presented with a situation, you make a choice, you get an outcome which affects your state, and then the key thing is the state affects what stories are available to you in turn. So you've got a virtuous cycle there. Now, many of you have probably come across choose your own adventure style approaches, multiple choice narrative, game books back in the 80s. Others of you, or the same ones, would have come across traditional parser-based interactive fiction, Infocom style games where you type things like Straight Moustache or Touch Moon. And both those things are in our DNA, as shamefully is the justly despised genre of social games, which I'll come back to, which we've been trying to rid ourselves of for the last 2 years. But the biggest difference between what we do and traditional choose your own adventure stuff is this combinatorial explosion. If any of you ever tried to design a branching narrative, you may get a familiar stress headache looking at this diagram. If you start out with a couple of choices and every choice with a couple more choices, then what you end up with is a gigantic branching if tree. And this is why we have, why programming does not consist solely of gigantic branching if trees, but branching narratives tend to come back to this. There are ways you can deal with it. You can have core gameplay that lives inside some of those bubbles, people doing the same thing. for a while to slow down the propagation of this stuff. You can join these nodes back together, but trying to keep continuity when you can traverse a tree in multiple ways can be quite tricky. So this approach, we got little modular disconnected chunks of narrative which are all loosely coupled. So as you develop qualities, those open up more stories in a more controllable way. It's easier to add to over time. So that's what excited me about this, why I started building something like this originally. I wrote the original code and content and then got other people in, was I liked the idea of having little delicious chunks of story that were collected in a slightly sort of loose, emergent way, where the game was all story and there was almost no gameplay, which is a bad idea in lots of ways, and we spent time recovering from that. But other things about what we're doing, I mentioned Story Nexus at the beginning of the platform. We harvested back the tools that we actually used to build the stories into a platform called Story Nexus, which is on the web. It's open, anybody can sign up and create a narrative with it. And we run a competition and feature the best ones on the front page. There's a monetization option built in, and we take a cut of revenue that people earn. Oh, that's the front page of Story Nexus. About half of the games in the tiles at the top there are community submitted. 3 of them won a competition. All the ones down below the fold are community submitted. Fall London, top left, are Victorian Enthusiasm. Evolve. I love that somebody used Story Nexus to build Evolve. It's an educational game about the evolution of single cellular life. And it's right next to a game about being a musketeer working for the Cardinal. Fantastic. And the one above it is a exotic far future science fiction romance about the destruction of a planet by an iron bird. So good variety of contents. It's immersive and ongoing as well. So it's web-based. There's no downloads or anything. It's not Unity or Flash. So it spools out over a period of days, weeks, months, or years. Fall in London, which is, as I said, insanely big. We've had people playing for on the order of 3 years in some cases. And there's some grind built in. So there's repeated action, which means that it spools out the story. This is partly a revenue-generating thing because we charge for extra actions, which is where I say the social game DNA came from. But we're trying to move away from that. It is social as well. It's not social in an exclusively evil way. One of the big problems... Okay, I'll talk about the social game thing. So 2009, when I left my lucrative job as a financial software developer for a job without a salary, at the beginning of a recession, trying to do a startup for reasons that now escape me. Social games were the gold rush, and my business plan was it'll be kind of like Mafia Wars, except it will have a narrative and not be shit. Therefore, it will make millions. In hindsight, the flaws in that reasoning became apparent, but I didn't ever want to be aggressively viral about it. I didn't want to gate content based on you having to recruit 5 of your friends to come and help tend your virtual farm. So with gentle virality, you had to log in through social networks, but it was quite civilized about what it made you do. Very civilized about what it made you do. Never posted to your stream without your permission. All the social stuff was optional. And it was a catch-22 situation because everybody saw that you still needed to sign in through Twitter or Facebook in order to play the game. So they thought they knew what kind of game it was. They didn't trust us. The fact that we had something on our front page saying we're civilized and we'll never post to your stream without permission meant nothing when we demanded access to your Facebook or Twitter account. And it was kind of, I think I said subsequently, like dressing up as Darth Vader, but failing actually to be allowed to use any dark force powers. You have all the public relations problems and none of the actual fun of it. So we've gradually been moving away from the social games model. You can now log in using just email and password. You don't need to use social networks at all. We've got a separate friends-based system, but because it is online, because that's kind of a naturally asynchronous multiplayer environment, there is still social stuff you can do. And it's free to play. I want to talk briefly about the free to play thing because this came up earlier when the guys from Paw Print were talking. We started doing free to play just because that's what social games did, and that seemed to be the way to make money when we started out down that road. But it makes sense for us because everything we offer is text, is story. It's quite hard to get people to pay for content on the web. This is why the newspaper industry's advertising revenues in the US in the last year are less than that of one company, Google. It's very hard to get people to pay for content behind a paywall. So by giving away an awful lot of our content free, it enables us to sell a small amount of that content because people have grown to like it enough that the small percentage of people who would ever pay for it decide to pay for it, and a slightly larger percentage of people who'd never have gone near it decide they do like it after all, after seeing all the free stuff we've got on display, so they come and do it. So for something like Fallen London or other games, it makes a certain sort of sense that you are giving away an awful lot of free content, as every content provider on the internet does, for free. And then you're asking people to pay for stuff. And because you're often asking them to pay for additional storylines or getting through storylines quicker, they're already interested in paying what you offer. We've made about 70% of our revenue on Fallen London from action refreshers, from the grind, monetizing the grind element, and about 30% from unlocking storylines, despite the fact that only 2% of the game is locked away behind any sort of paywall. And my takeaway from that is actually unlocking storylines is a way more effective means of monetizing content than action refreshers, because people always feel a bit taken advantage of when they pay for action refreshers. They can just wait around to do it. If they're really loving the game, they'll pay to advance, but they can see you put arbitrary blocks in their path. Whereas if they're paying a few pence for a little bit of extra content, they know they like the content, they've already consumed a chunk of it, they just want essentially extra value features. That makes sense. So despite the fact you can pay to get quicker through all of the game with actions, and you can pay to get only into a tiny part of the game with branch unlocks, the branch unlocks constitute 30% of our revenue. So we want to do more of that in future. Okay, Fallen London, is it a game or a story? And the surprising answer, it's so predictable I won't bother keeping it from you, it is in fact both. But considering in what ways it is each, is helping us working out what we need to say about it, and I'm going to use it as a springboard for talking more about game and story and the overlaps between them being less meta. Because whether stories can work in games, whether stories are anti-game or games are antithetical to story is kind of a topic of discussion. It's the sort of thing that you can easily start a fight about over at Gama Sutra. Okay, so these cards, by the way, we ran a Kickstarter which did fairly well to do a prequel game to Fallen London, and the Opportunity deck were part of our Kickstarter rewards. It's a physical deck which mimics the cards that we use in the game. I love cards as a metaphor for gameplays. People immediately understand what they're doing because they feel like things you have, because they fit really well with symbols. They're little slices of frozen meaning. Because my co-founder, who's a very characterful artist, is very good at doing icons that are just about card size, which helps. But people are used to the idea that you deal a card or you play a card and something interesting happens, and then you have to play another one. So that's a really good fit for our little tiny chunks of story. Yeah, anyway, it is a game in that it has cards, it has rules, it has challenges. So if you're playing Fallen London, you've got cards, which immediately are ludic. There's an underlying model because you've got an interactive narrative that you're exploring. There's a large non-linear space that you're getting through in a sort of exploratory navigational way. You're working out the underlying rules. You're working out that if your suspicion quality gets too high, you end up in prison. You're working out if your scandal quality gets too high, then you end up having to flee the city in disgrace. You're working out that you need to raise your dangerous quality in order to hunt fungus towers and keep your suspicious quality low in order to be let in at the palace. It's got rules. And it's got puzzle elements, it's got challenge elements, it's got grind elements. So all those things are fundamentally game-like. They're not things that you'd find in purely narrative entertainment. But it is almost entirely text. I say almost entirely text with a substantial picture in the middle of the screen, but we have 850,000 words of content in Fallen London, over 2 million words in Story Nexus, and about 600 icons. So the balance is towards text, and obviously it is the text that we're selling. It's the text that allows people to interact with the game. If my co-founder, the artist, were here, he'd be trying to break me in two right now. And we have a long-running debate about the merits of text versus art, but I'm here and he's not. And of course, it's fundamentally story-based, so it's a story in that respect. And characters are a key part of it. Now, characters in games are important as well. Characters as art assets, characters as elements of a franchise, characters as hooks for story. But Fallen London has this ridiculous cast of characters who serve a recurring purpose and who act in pseudo-autonomous ways that most games don't allow for. Already you're thinking of a bunch of exceptions. There are a bunch of exceptions, but games as a whole don't rely on characters. So obviously it's both. And obviously that's caused us a variety of problems when trying to market it. So when I started Failbetter, wanted to do something that was story-y and game-y, because I love both. I'd always wanted to write. I'd always been a gamer. And I think it's fair to say that story has not been gaming's finest hour. There are some really brilliant standout exceptions. I can think of a dozen games easily that have superb, well-executed stories, whether those are scripted or whether they're emergent, player-driven, gameplay-driven. And I can think of about 1,000 that are embarrassingly bad. Not just vacant, but risible. So I wanted to do something in that space and to join the folk who do something more interesting with it. But because I really wanted to be a writer, what I ended up doing was much more story-y than gamey. But nevertheless, we called it a game. The company's called Failbetter Games. All our PR is through the gaming press. We won the Escapist's Best Browser Game Award in 2009 as a game. We got commissioned to make a game by Channel 4 Education. We got commissioned to make a promotional game by Random House. All this stuff was about games. And despite that, when we asked our audience how they self-identified, this is what we got. 13% were primarily gamers, 20% were primarily readers, 61% were both. So after 3 years of pushing it as a game, more than twice as many of our players didn't really think of themselves as gamers, as thought of themselves as solely gamers. And the question that led to both, we were really emphatic about it. We were, okay, you're passionate about being a reader and you're passionate about it being a gamer. You really think of yourself as a gamer and as a book lover. So they said a couple of things to me. One is that our marketing was, not to my surprise, incompetent, because me and my co-founder were responsible for it. We were rubbish at that. Two, more encouragingly, I think there is an audience of people who do think of themselves as readers and gamers. And I characterise that as people who consume a lot of genre fiction. I mean, our stuff tends to be fantasy and science fiction, which obviously is gaming's home ground. People who probably have consumed a transmedia franchise, even if they don't know what the words mean, or even if they do not know what the words mean and it makes them vaguely nauseous. People who are interested in something like Who or Mad Men or Battlestar Galactica, or something else that has a plot and a storyline that crosses multiple channels. Yeah, one of the problems about being a game and a story and trying to satisfy readers and gamers is that the audience has substantially different expectations in each case. For one thing, there are no moving images in our game. So people argue every so often about whether it's a video game or not at all, again in air quotes. There are things people would accept are games that have no moving images, but again, they're very much the exception rather than the rule. So when people are lured to our site by the promise of a game, and they find that it consists of static painted cards with text hidden behind them, often they get disappointed. Similarly, readers expecting a reading experience can get put off by the gaming elements. This is another project we're involved with. The technical guy on this was Ian Millington, who writes books on artificial intelligence, coding, and actually lives locally somewhere in Newport. Veritale, which is this project, brilliant work in lots of ways, some very technically impressive stuff going on at the back end. It's a platform that allows people to build interactive fiction. Tragically, Ian has been really ill for some time, so it's been sitting in early beta and hasn't been pushed forwards, but do take a look at it. Aside from anything else, it's gorgeous to look at. But Ian's idea was that we would make something look like a book, and by doing that, attract readers. And every time somebody came to the discussion group and said, I'd like to be able to do X in this. And he said, well, we're trying to make interactive books rather than games, and what you've suggested is a game sort of thing, so we shouldn't really do it. They got disappointed and tended to move on. And I think if you try to tell somebody that that they're going to be playing a book and that it's going to behave like a book, you make it look like a book, and then it does game-like things under the covers, it's going to disappoint and confuse them. If people really hate tomato ketchup and you say, okay, no, but have a go at this, it's not ketchup, it's tomato jam, you will fool them until they open the bottle if you're lucky. So, some specifics. It's a game, it's a story. There are a bunch of parallels and a bunch of differences in the way that the techniques are applied even along those parallels. I want to make a distinction between two kinds of story in games. This is something that a lot of discussion around story in games stalls on, I think. Extrinsic story versus intrinsic story. So, two comments into any comment thread on Gama Sutra about whether you can have stories in games. Somebody will say, the best stories in games are the ones you create yourself, and things like Dwarf Fortress or The Sims, or anything else with strongly emergent gameplay, where people can write game diaries, where people can assign names or behaviours to characters in there, where people can tell each other what's happened, where people can see their own actions have consequences. It's why open world games are so popular, because people feel the story belongs to them, and it's very, very hard to get right. So and often the conversation founders there, because people say that's the kind of story you should have in games. I can think of enough, I said a dozen just to be provocative earlier, but there are many more. I can think of a number of exceptional stories in games which are purely extrinsic, purely scripted, where you simply have good writing, good characterization, interesting plots, strong backstories. There's no reason you can't have a strong story in a game, even though it may not be the best medium for any given particular story. So extrinsic stories, stuff where you've got a script. Intrinsic stories, stuff where the players are making their own story. And I think you could further draw a distinction there between tools for making stories and tools for making experiences. So I think something like Dwarf Fortress is a tool for making stories. How many of you know what Dwarf Fortress is, just to be... Okay, Dwarf Fortress, look it up, crazy project. There's the two brothers who live in the cabin somewhere in the woods in Minnesota or somewhere. And they've been building this insanely complicated ASCII-based dwarf simulator for about the last 10 years. And it's got an interface that looks like an instrument of torture. It's all keystroke commands and ASCII. And it's got a really sophisticated set of AI routines that determine how your dwarves travel around the tunnels you've dug for them and the different motivations they have and the different crafting materials they have, and they'll develop feuds, they'll go mad from loneliness, or they'll become obsessed with crafting stuff, or I can't help wondering if the brothers are reading some of their own motivations into this somewhere. But Dwarf Fortress has a tremendously hardcore and very small following because the learning curve is like this. But people write long, involved diaries about it. The Sims, much more mainstream example. How many of you came across Alice and Kev? Alice and Kev, a Sims project by a guy named Ro Berkey, who set up a crazy old homeless guy and his talented, compassionate daughter in a tiny plot of wasteland in a Sims game, a kind of much advanced version of the old Sims trick of imprisoning a character in a tiny space with no toilet. And just watch the drama between these two play out. Watch this guy abusing his daughter and the daughter trying to do the right thing and posting money to charity and them trying to move into people's nearby houses. And he wrote it as a game diary online. It's quite a moving narrative. So you get people building with games like The Sims or Dwarf Fortress, you get them building narratives, recording narratives and sharing those war stories with other people. A lot of you have probably had an experience where you've talked about sorry, slightly different thing. So people are building stories and telling other people about them, building environments. And then there are games where there's a story that's very emergent, where it generates war stories, but it's just about what happens in a really tightly scripted bound. And the best example of this, I think, is Left 4 Dead. where they've set up a really, really tight set of rules that cause emergent, interesting things to happen. So all these are intrinsic stories, and I've cleverly talked about them while leaving the word extrinsic on the slide up there just to make the point. But yeah, this is the point about stories in games not being all they could be. I would like to see us move past the point where we're trying to make mature stories in games. Jonas Karatzi's independent game developer did a very entertaining blog piece on this just last week. There's lots of daft adolescent stories in games. Space Marines and Maverick Detectives. I like Space Marines and Maverick Detectives, actually. I have a lot of fun playing those games, but I do get tired when I play the 20th. And the response to this often has been to try to make stories that are in some way more adult. And I think if you explicitly try to make a story that's more adult, you end up with either art house or grindhouse. You either end up with something that's desperately self-conscious that's trying to make an art point, or you end up with something that is about sex or violence or anything else that looks vigorously X-rated. And good stories are just well-told narratives about interesting characters interacting in a compelling way who you care about in a thematically consistent way. They don't have to be either of those things. You don't need the exploitation, and you don't need the self-conscious grimness. Or Emily Short, who's a well-respected interactive fiction author. I'm not going to read this whole thing, but I love this rant about the kind of writing you get in indie games sometimes. And if you've played any number of indie games, some of this will be terribly familiar. Like reading a collage of the manuscript sent to a high school poetry contest right after one of the students got in a fatal crash. So I think it's entirely possible to have mature, interesting, extrinsic stories without needing to resort to explicitly artistic stuff, let alone explicitly kind of grindhouse stuff. Okay, intrinsic stories. This slide is what should have been up when I was talking about the different kinds of intrinsic story earlier. Where I got slightly sidetracked is it is possible to have stories in games. We know this because there have been excellent stories in games. There is a purist argument that I see a lot of on the internet that it isn't appropriate to have a story in game unless the story itself is game-like, unless it's intrinsic. And yeah, I disagree. Okay, again, specifics. So Fallen London, insane amount of content, 800,000 words. You can get lost in it, wander around for months. And as I say, we like crazy aunts up in our attic, we just keep on knitting. One of the things about stories is that pacing is paramount. The J.K. Rowlings and Stephen Kings of this world may or may not be extraordinary prose writers, but they know how to, the phrase is usually tell a story. And almost always what people understand by that is the pacing is right, that you keep on turning the pages, that you know that something interesting will happen every so often, and I can see people nodding. And the intervals between interesting things happen are well tuned to you. And not only do you learn to, not only can you be guaranteed that something interesting will come along every so often, but also the intervals are narrow enough and there's enough other things happening in between that you keep going for it. And this, of course, is something that happens in games as well, but the problem in games is that you control the pacing, largely. I mean, something like Crazy Rapids? Wacky Rapids. Wacky Rapids, you know, you're on a time track, so you're not controlling how long things take, I would imagine. But you're still controlling when interesting stuff happens because you're acting on it. And this is one of the things, whether with extrinsic or intrinsic stories, that's very difficult to get right, is ensuring that the pacing between interesting stuff happening is what players would expect. Notoriously, if there's a strong extrinsic story in a platformer or something, you know, a game with a really compelling story like Ico even, your player gets stuck and wanders around a level for 20 minutes rather than seeing the next story beat. So by the time the story beat comes along, they're not interested. So the way we've dealt with this in Fallen London and in our other games is this modular aspect that I mentioned earlier, that we have small chunks of story that evolve into loosely coupled stuff. So within each each chunk of story, you can be reasonably certain that things are going to happen every so often at a reasonably interesting pace. So that, I think, ultimately makes us a more storyish than gameish, because we are still imposing the rhythm which the extrinsic story unfolds. Gratification in the economy. So Fallen London is kind of RPG-like in lots of ways. You do stuff. You kill beasts and you get paid for it. You seduce poets and they give you presents. And I naively thought, when I started writing it, that I just give away stuff at the end of every storylet, and people would enjoy that because they were getting stuff, and the story was the important part. The thing is, when people can see they're being given stuff for no reason, they quickly don't care about the stuff. And at that point, there's no point in having the stuff in the game. If you get chunks of jade every time you seduce a poet, you end up with a huge pile of chunks of jade you can do nothing with. This is Virtual Economy 101, which sadly I hadn't read when I first started building the game. So the fact that something is nominally story-driven, if it includes any economic elements, you have to treat those economic elements in a considered way, and you have to provide people something to do with them, otherwise they become just a pointless score that racks up on the right-hand side of the screen. Not only that, but if you have anything that is apportioned in a limited way in the game, the principles of virtual economies apply. So you play Stories in Fallen London, you get chunks of jade, or talking ravens, or overgoats, or spiders, or whatever. And those are items which you need to do something economically interesting with. But you also unlock the cheesemonger's mystery, or you gather clues about where the drownings come from. And again, if you have to gather a certain number of these things before you unlock the next part of the story, if you need to increase your surveillance quality to 10 before you find out where the character you're chasing has gone, those things are just an extension of the economy. The fact that we're calling them story beats, the fact that they don't get represented in an inventory, the fact that you can't sell them in a market, doesn't mean that they aren't fundamentally economic items. It doesn't mean that you can duck thinking about how often you can give them out, what people can do with them, and effectively what the drop rate of a particular story beat is. This is something that novels, that linear narratives, that pure stories don't need to worry about, because you only have one economy item in a novel, and that's the reader's attention. The reader chooses to spend their attention on each page in order to advance the plot. They can skip it if they like, and it's consumed at the same rate regardless. So that pushes down more to the game side. So we pace like a story, but we have an economy like a game, which is difficult. Navigation and feedback. I was talking to, I think, one of the guys from Paw Print earlier, and game design is just experience design. If something isn't really a game, isn't nominally a game, but does game-like things, then you still need to take account of all the principles of giving feedback, all the principles of allowing people to navigate that you would if it were actually nominally a game. When we first built Fallen London, we just assumed that people would find their way through the story because we were treated like a story, and they got lost in it. Any kind of experience needs to take account of the same sort of principles of feedback and decision-making that basic game design does, or you run into problems. Competition and cooperation, we have them in Fallen London, you don't have them in stories. It puts us more on the game side of the fence. And this, so we've got 800,000 words of content, which is a lot for anybody to hold in their mind at any one time, even if they've written the game, let alone if they've played it in disconnected chunks over a period of 15 months. We were unsympathetic to players initially who said, let us keep notes somewhere in the game. Let us record stuff that has happened in the game. Let us copy and paste stuff without needing to keep an external notepad file. We just kept saying, you need to do these things when you're reading a book. You wouldn't insist that a book author allows you gives you an interface to write stuff in the margins, or sends you a free notepad with his book. But the difference between a non-linear narrative and a story is that a non-linear narrative, you can't just flip back to the same page you looked at any time. You can't skip ahead. You can't search as you can on a Kindle for instance the different words. So if you're creating a non-linear narrative, you simply have to allow people, whether it's a quest journal, whether it's a diary online that they can echo to, whether it's a note-taking facility, some way to track what's going on, or it becomes no longer fun. The T word, transmedia. How many of you know what I mean by transmedia? How many of you find the word vaguely disgusting? That's fair. So I've been on or sat in front of a number of transmedia panels, and you generally get this point at the beginning where everybody, including the people who work for transmedia companies, kind of richly abjures the word. It's sort of like seeing people trampling on a crucifix in an unusual cult or something. But story is crossing boundaries between games and other forms of narrative. You do get worlds, and they're usually whole franchises with background mysteries, where you unlock part of it in a game, part of it in the TV series. You'll have a second screen open in your lap, and you'll be poking through some sort of alternate reality game. You're doing it. It's something that began with Star Wars and has gone far beyond those boundaries. And what we'd like to, this is something that we really embrace reluctantly, because transmedia does have this terribly buzzwordy feel, is StoryNext is our platform to be a place where narratives get extended out of other things. So if you have a piece of content in StoryNexus that's unlocked by you playing through another game, where you have an access code from a TV show that you can play through, we'd like to do more with that. And we're thinking about calling it immersive fiction, because another marketing issue, interactive fiction is a really difficult name. It means text-based fiction as far as most people are concerned. It means the Infocom games of the 80s, which are great and which are one of our inspirations, but a very hard sell these days. One of the other things we're interested in with StoryNexus is the idea that if people are building an intrinsic narrative, if people are trying to create an experience themselves, then they necessarily have some input into the story. We don't like the idea that we give away authorial control, because that way lies anarchy. We still like the idea that the story is fundamentally authored. But if you've got a web-based platform that allows people to add content to it in real time, it makes sense to allow them some sort of role in the creation of the narrative. Yeah, this is one of the other audience research bits we did earlier. We asked people whether they consider themselves readers or gamers. We asked people why they actually like playing the game. And this one came out top, far higher than we expected. We thought the escapism would be more important. We thought that exploring this world we spent all this time building would be significant, but the top one is basically a story thing, not a game thing. And in the end, what we're in the business of is trying to unlock stories a little bit at a time. So the glib ending to the talk is that really what we're doing is not a story, not a game, but a mystery. That what we are doing is giving away chunks of information a little bit at a time, that we're still in the business of selling content and trying to make it as tantalizing as possible. So it doesn't really help us advance the marketing story, unfortunately. Anyway, that's the talk. Questions?
Got one? No one else wants to jump in?
Yep.
And why do you think it is that there's so many games which don't have good stories? With these massive studios with lots of money, why aren't they investing more in good stories, do you think?
Because I think it's, largely speaking, unnecessary. I think if a game is brilliant, then the story is going to be gratuitous 9 times out of 10. If you're really into a game for the story, if you can't play a game without a decent story, which I can't, then you'll feel the lack. But lots and lots of games don't need stories. And adding it, even if it's only 5% extra expense, that's 5% extra expense. So you've got that context to begin with. And then you've got a long tradition of people not needing to put stories in games. So you've got the kind of expectation that you don't need stories in games. So I think it's always going to be a minority interest, that most of your story serves a basic purpose. And as for the Hollywood blockbuster, nobody needs an extraordinary story to sell a Hollywood blockbuster that has boobs and explosions and helicopters. But that doesn't mean that the stories are necessarily valueless.
Can I ask about the stories that you put up on Story Nexus, whether you think they suffer because they've got to be chunked into small pieces, and therefore they can't truly be, from A to B?
So
So if someone's got, for example, wet hair,
mhm.
the next bit, they can't reference stuff that could be caught out, if that makes sense.
It does make sense, and the answer is yes and no. So it's no, straightforwardly, because you can build a purely linear story in Story Nexus. You can have a storylet that advances a plot quality to 2, and the plot quality at 2 unlocks a story where it's advanced it to 3. So you could do something in a really linear way, or a very simply branching way. But if the example is that somebody's got wet hair at the end of a storylet, then maybe that's never relevant again. Maybe you actually don't care about whether or not they have wet hair in a subsequent scene. And if you do care, if it is important, you give them a wet hair quality, which you can then use to pick up stuff later and say, okay, here's a dry your hair choice, or here's a you were electrocuted condition. Most narrative is montage. Only quite experimental stuff, or really documentary stuff, covers every single event from the beginning to the end. If you look at a film, there are gaps between scenes. If you look at a comic book, there's, Scott McCloud calls it blood in the gutters. A lot of important stuff happens in the gaps between panels for now to do stuff. In a TV show, there's stuff assumed to happen between episodes, so you don't always show every single outcome anyway. Now, it's a little bit disingenuous, because if you're telling stories in a paragraph at a time, you do lose some sort of coherence, and they are more fluid than that. But there are ways around that, and it is something fundamental to narrative.
Does that change the way you think people would write then on this kind of platform?
Yes, very much. What we usually see, and this is our kind of base guideline, is for a setup, have a paragraph. For a choice, have a sentence, maybe 2. For a result, have a paragraph. If you've got a big dramatic scene where you need to unleash the exposition demon, then you might need more than that. And some people just like writing long. Some people have a style that fits more but when they're expansive. But writing in small chunks is useful. One of the other things about story in games, the kind of desire to do a proper grown-up story manifests in all kinds of dreadful ways. One is the kind of art house, grindhouse thing. Another is that people think, novels and plays have great stories. Novels and plays are long, so you need long text in order to be a good story. Which is why you get some games starting with a text crawl like this. I am really in favour of anything that pushes back a story towards really small chunks, where you have to think very carefully about what you're going to say. Story Next is all about text, so it's less of an issue. But in a game, any time you stop the game to tell a story, the player is expecting to go on with the game in a moment. So what you tell them needs to be really interesting if it's going to hold their attention. And if it's not, they'll skip it. World of Warcraft originally had unskippable quest text. You had to wait for the whole thing to scroll down because they wanted to make sure that people read it. And what happens is people stop looking at the screen while it scrolled down. They meant to have got themselves a cup of tea. So 2 years on, they admitted defeat. And now there's a skip button, so you can just go straight to the bottom, because you can't force people to read what amounts to boilerplate text.
Yeah, I think you mentioned it for the TV shows earlier on,
Mm-hmm.
that seem to do some of the same things you guys do story-wise, like set up lots of mysteries and stuff, and then,
Mm-hmm.
and then wrap them up later. But the thing with those TV shows is that they eventually they kind of come to an end.
Mm-hmm.
Have to tie up all the loose ends, and then the game side of things, with everyone moving at their own pace to different parts of the story,
Mhm.
and kind of like, do you and you wanting to keep it going as long as possible to keep the money coming in?
Mhm.
Do you have any sort of end game for how it's all going to come together?
Really good question. Yes, but so we know how the plot's going to turn out. Broadly speaking, we don't start something without knowing how it could possibly end. We all watched Twin Peaks at an impressionable age, and we were always scarred by the way the second season went. So there's that. I think actually most shows, I believe, that use mystery and teasers and long training storylines as an attraction probably work the same way we do. It's just that it costs a lot more to make a TV show than it does to write 5 paragraphs of text. So there's less of it. Shows want to continue as long as they can. They want to leave cliffhangers. They want people to come back for the next season. And notoriously, some of the shows that have been most about unspooling mystery gradually, if I say Lost, I won't surprise anybody, people haven't always been satisfied by the way they turned out and the way they wrap stuff up. So I think this temptation to keep things spooling out is there, but it isn't unique to us. But also, people are only going to play for so long. You know, at the very, if you wrote 9 million words of story nexus, there would be a few die-hard souls there at the end, demanding to know what we'd done with the Revolutionary Firebrand and why we'd never finished his story. But most other people would have fallen away long since. And one of the problems for us is that with our mad ants in the attic knitting effect, where we keep expanding the edge of the story, new players don't reach the edges necessarily, so there's a diminishing return effect from writing more content. So what you want to do is go back and enrich and improve the earlier content, or push them into other games where they can start afresh.
So I was coming to this event, I played for London last night, and I found it a strangely unchallenging experience, because there was no puzzles or engaging. It was quite easy to play it at quite a passive level, which I found strangely dissatisfying. I mean, the setup was good. I got the period setting, the atmosphere. I was hoping for something that would draw me in a deeper way to it.
So this is, as often, there's two answers. One answer is if you play on a bit further, then there are some genuine puzzles, but not many. So I'm guessing, given that you're a game dev event and you found it unchallenging, you probably play games.
Yeah.
Yeah. So some folk who play Fall in London have never played games, and some folk literally bounce off the tutorial because they can't work out how to get through it. Now, some of that is just UX design on our part not being sufficiently good, but because we have this weird hybrid audience, we have to cater for all sorts. We have some early bit of feedback. Somebody said to me that they found it a soothing experience. They liked that there wasn't any challenge, and they didn't really even read all the text between clicking the buttons, but they liked that it was there because it made them feel like somebody had made the effort. So it was kind of like having, I don't know, leather seats in a car or something. That they. It wasn't our intention, but I think there's a proportion of our audience who would probably play Farmville if they weren't playing this, and play this because they like the idea of something that looks a bit more literary and interesting, and where they dip into the text, it is actually reasonably intelligently written and it's funny or whatever. But no, this is right on the crux of this story game divide that I was talking about, that what we've provided doesn't satisfy audiences who think of themselves mostly as gamers, which is one of the problems with describing it as a game. People who are there, even people who are there for the story may find that satisfying in those terms, but we don't provide challenge in that sense. There is a challenge in optimizing what you're doing, so trying to work out that you need to acquire 100 coruscating souls in order to buy your rooms above the bazaar, and the best way to do that is this. But that's quite a kind of dry spreadsheety activity. There are other bits of the game, listen to me, of the project, which we explicitly made more game-like. There's something like a mini-game where you're drawing cards and trying to raise certain stats before other ones drop, which is more like a bit of a gameplay challenge. But that's not most of what we do. So that's a feature, not a bug, but I'm not sure it's necessarily a benefit. Does that make sense? Guilty as charged.
You say yourself, you're kind of jumping between whether it is a game or whether it's a story and such. As such, how did you market it initially? Because I presume you have the hardcore readers, players, whatever, at this stage, but the initial marketing, where were you aiming, where were you advertising this to bring in the readers, gamers?
So, again, it's painful to talk about this. Looking back on my bright-eyed and optimistic 2009 self. You know, I was only 22 years old in 2009. I've aged 18 years in the intervening 3 years. I thought, well, it'll be like Mafia Wars, and that's like totally viral, and everybody plays it. But it'll be interesting, it'll have a good narrative, so everybody wants to tell their friends. So it'll be super viral squared. So we only needed to do marketing, it would just spread like wildfire through Twitter. Again, in my defence, Spy Master, which you might remember, very spammy, very viral Twitter game, would just spread like wildfire a month before, so I had that precedent. But our initial marketing, such as it was we went to a couple of events in London and handed out business cards and told everybody how great our game was and hoped it would spread. And we were lucky, and we got a few opinion formers and some contacts that got us some client work, and that provided a good base to move on from. But our initial marketing, a marketing director for a long time has been the second role that our illustrator has. So we did take it to games conferences. That answers the point about initial positioning.
Yep. Is there any potential for putting this onto like ebooks or anything like that in the nature of going?
No, but so what we've got is a server-based web technology. Every time that you make a choice, it calls home to find out what the options are. And that has to happen because it can be edited in real time. People can literally add storylets while you're playing other chunks of a Story Nexus world. So there's no way we could survive on a Kindle or an iOS update cycle. And it would be technically difficult as well, but you know, those kind of technical problems can always be overcome. But I was looking at some studies about ebook use in the UK, and to my surprise, something like a quarter of people who download ebooks say that they read them on PCs or laptops. And more people read them on, I think, laptops than on iPads. Obviously, Kindles and e-readers are by far the most popular. But even those, you're getting an evolution where e-readers tend also to do tablets, things like the Kindle Fire, things like people reading large numbers on iPads. So what we're expecting to see is that we stick around for a bit, not having, needing an always-on internet connection will be an even more trivial problem than it is at the moment, and there's not much point in doing other than optimising for mobile platforms.
Okay.